Hey, do you want to make an appearance in our video? Come here. Sit down. Good girl. Yeah, there you go. Now I want to start off with someone who I would really like to highlight because I think that her story has often been overlooked, even overshadowed by others, just simply due to the fact that she wasn't as famous as some of her friends. The person that I'm talking about is Abigail Folger. And like I said back in episode 7, she is one of those rare people who end up becoming better known just because of the circumstances of their death rather than the events of their actual life. Abigail Folger was born in 1943 in San Francisco, California. And yes, as the name implies, she was born into the very wealthy Folger family, as in Folger's Coffee. Now, back in those days, there was no Starbucks. So if you wanted coffee and you were buying it at the grocery store, well, you would have had much fewer choices back then than you would have now. You may have had Maxwell House or Nescafe or Hills Brothers, but Folgers was definitely the biggest brand back then. And that family business was the undisputed king of supermarket coffee found in a tin can. Her father, Peter Folger, was the president and the CEO of that company at the time that Abigail was born. And Abigail, being the eldest child of Peter Folger, was set to inherit all of that family's massive fortune. So yes, she was born into a life of extreme wealth and privilege. And so naturally, she lived exactly the kind of life that you would have expected her to have lived, having been born into a family as rich as they were. She was educated in private schools, and she was an honor student, and she was very gifted and very active in the fields of music and theater and art. After high school, at the age of 18, she decided that she wanted to make a move over to the completely opposite side of the country, and she enrolled as a student at Radcliffe College in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And once again, she excelled in music and theater, and she graduated with honors from Radcliffe. Immediately after that, she was a graduate student at Harvard University, and she earned her master's degree in art history at the age of 23 in 1967. She returned back to the San Francisco Bay Area, and for a very short time, she took a job at the University of California Art Museum in Berkeley. Now, as we've already concluded, Abigail Folger was already wealthy just by being a member of the Folger family, and she was destined to become even much wealthier based on what she was going to inherit from her father. So she didn't have to work, but she wanted to, and she made it very clear from a young age that she was determined to make her mark in the world by doing something valuable, positive, and worthwhile, rather than just being rich for reasons that had nothing to do with any of the accomplishments that she may have had in her life. Now, these worthy goals that she had actually turned out to be something more of a double-edged sword for her. And there were detrimental effects on her sense of self-worth and her emotional state of mind by the time she was in her early 20s. She wanted to know where she fit into the world. So it was this personal quest that she had to determine her own sense of value to herself and to the rest of society that led her to move back to the East Coast, to New York City, where she took a job working for a magazine publisher. And again, she was already living on a family allowance of what would be the equivalent in today's money of well over $1 million a year. She worked because she wanted to. She had only been in New York City for roughly about 2 months when she was introduced to a man at a party who was several years older than she was, He was a Polish immigrant who had aspirations to be a screenwriter. And this, of course, was Wojciech Frykowski. And he had only been in the United States for less than an entire month and spoke not a word of English. But no problem, they were both fluent in French. And this is precisely how they communicated during the time that Wojciech was attempting to learn to speak English. Now, a little known fact about him. He was not born into poverty. The truth is, his father once owned a textile mill in Poland, but that factory was destroyed by the Nazis during World War II when Wojciech was only about 4 years old. So, by the time he had arrived in the United States in 1967, he was 30 years old and basically penniless. His actual trip to the United States was paid for by his childhood friend, Roman Polanski, also from Poland. Soon after he had met Abigail, she invited him to move in with her in the apartment that she was renting in Manhattan. And it was at this point that Abigail Folger basically began financing Wojciech Frykowski's entire life. Now, back to Abigail. It was during this time, starting in early 1968, that she began to get involved as a volunteer for the political campaign of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, as he was beginning his initial campaign to run for president of the United States. But as we all know, that campaign came to a very abrupt end in June of 1968, when Robert Kennedy was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. This tragedy had a profound effect on the young Abigail Folger, and this event was essentially the first of a string of emotional setbacks that she would experience over the course of the next 14 months and the last 14 months of her life. And so, it was in August of 1968 that she and her boyfriend, Wojciech, decided that they would leave New York City and move to Los Angeles, where Wojciech would continue in his quest to become a Hollywood screenwriter with the help of his friend, Roman Polanski. Abigail had now decided that she wanted to spend her time volunteering as a social worker, much like her own mother did back in San Francisco. And she registered herself as an unsalaried worker with the Los Angeles County Welfare Department. That was in September of 1968. And again, this decision would prove to be a major turning point in Abigail's short life, but not necessarily in a profoundly happy or positive way. Okay, here's where I need to back up and make a small correction about some previous information that I had shared earlier in another video regarding this house and who may or may not have owned it back in 1968. I mistakenly said that Abigail Folger had purchased this house on Woodstock Road back when she and Wojciech moved here to Laurel Canyon. Well, it turns out she did not own the house. She was just renting it. So I'm sorry about that. And like I said earlier, I like to make sure that all the information in my videos is correct. And I don't like giving out false information about anything, even something that might seem as unimportant as this little piece of trivia. So it turns out that the owners of this house, who she was renting from back in 1968 and 1969, lived on the property right next door at 2700 Woodstock Road. And they were a German couple named Schultz. So anyway, we're at the part now where Abigail and Wojciech are here now in Laurel Canyon back in the late summer of 1968 and living here at 2774 Woodstock Road. And it didn't take long for them to meet up with and befriend Cass Elliot, who lived very close by. And well, we'll get to more details on all of that part because it will all eventually come up again later. At this point in time, Abigail Folger's main goal in life is to throw herself headfirst into the idea of becoming a social worker in some of the poorest inner city neighborhoods of Los Angeles. And since she obviously didn't need the money, she's doing all of this now full-time, 100% on a volunteer basis. But unfortunately, here is where things really start to go awry for her in her own personal life. Now remember, Abigail Folger was born and raised in a very wealthy family, and she was used to the idea of mingling with others in high society and with other people who were more or less within her own socioeconomic bracket. She has never been exposed to this level of just abject poverty, crime, and destitute conditions that she's seeing now on a daily basis, up close and personal, in areas like Watts and the neighborhoods around South Central LA. And she's getting up at dawn every single day to get herself out there, and she's staying for long hours at a time. So this is not only an eye-opening experience for her, it's also causing her mental anguish and depression. She's finding it hard to leave work at work, and she's bringing this anxiety back home with her every night. Now, to top all of this off, her relationship with Frykowski is beginning to fray at the edges, and she is now beginning to suspect him of basically just using her and her money in order to take part in some shady and nefarious activities with some of the locals in the area, some of whom he had apparently become acquainted with over at Cass Elliott's house at some point within this same time frame. So now Abigail has started to try to find a way to deal with all of these new challenges in her life. The stress, the anguish, and all of the difficulties that she's now having in her personal relationship with her boyfriend, Wojciech, who, by the way, is not really doing a whole lot of writing at this point in his life while he's at home, but rather he seems to have been trying to find other ways that he thinks are going to start bringing in extra income that wasn't coming directly out of Abigail's bank account. In other words, he's getting himself mixed up deeper and deeper with these two other guys, Dawson and Doyle, that came up in the last episode. And now Wojciech Frykowski is in the distribution business of not only marijuana, but also cocaine, heroin, possibly even methamphetamine. So, how's she dealing with all of this? Well, it turns out that now she is self-medicating herself with these exact same substances. And it would appear that she's getting it from Wojciech. And he seems to really be into it as well. And then, to add even one more layer of stress to her situation that she was already dealing with, beginning in April of 1969, Abigail decided that she wanted to get herself involved in another political campaign. Again, completely as a volunteer for the Los Angeles mayoral candidate, Tom Bradley. He was an African-American man who was running against a much more conservative white opponent named Sam Yorty. And Sam Yorty was able to eventually convince voters that Tom Bradley was somehow connected with the Black nationalist movement, which of course he was not. This campaign was bitter and it was ugly, and it was divided along racial lines. And in the end, Yorty was victorious over Bradley, leaving Abigail Folger feeling defeated, and she took it personally. And the results of this campaign left her feeling even more frustrated about race relations in the late 1960s. Now, if Abigail had lived she would have seen Tom Bradley come back in 1973 and unseat Yorty, becoming the first black mayor of Los Angeles, and then holding that position for another 20 years. So there is a lot of speculation out there regarding Abigail Folger and her alleged drug habit, which seems like it started shortly after she arrived in Laurel Canyon. Now, to her credit, it's not like her decision to use certain types of drugs was her only mechanism for dealing with many of her personal problems. She was smarter than that. And she was seeing a psychiatrist 5 days a week, every day, Monday through Friday at 4:30 p.m. in Los Angeles. That's very well documented. As a matter of fact, that had been going on for quite some time, and it was going on right up until the afternoon of August the 8th, which of course was the final full day that she was actually alive. And like I just said earlier, these appointments with her psychiatrist that were scheduled for 5 days a week, which lasted probably about the last 6 to 8 months of her life, were very well documented. And it came out later, after her death, that there were additional issues that she was facing in her life that were related to her background, her family, and basically where she was from in life. Now you have to remember, with a family name as well known as Folger, most people are going to know exactly where you came from. And even if she wasn't internationally famous, the Folger family name was very well known at that time. And the problem that this caused for her was because the Folgers Coffee Company has been around since about 1850, and they became very successful very quickly. And so they're considered old money. And a lot of people held that against her and judged her for it in a very negative way. And even though Abigail was artistically gifted, she played the piano, she read music, but she wasn't a recording artist. She wasn't a pop star. She was active and involved in theater arts, both in high school and in college. But she wasn't a film star, so she never really fit into either one of those categories. Certainly not at that level of the very famous people that she was now associating with in Laurel Canyon. But she was wealthy, very wealthy, and in most cases, she had more money than a lot of the same people that we're talking about right now. And so knowing all of this made her feel a certain amount of guilt because of it, and she became very self-conscious. She was also very aware of the fact that because she was from the Folger family, that people were just going to, in some cases, view her negatively and just consider her to be from old money. And so to sum it all up, Abigail Folger was just really dealing with a lot of very serious issues in her life. And this one was just one more of the many. And so we asked the question, was Abigail Folger a full-blown drug addict during the final year of her life while she lived in the Los Angeles area? My opinion, I just don't think she lived long enough for that habit to have gotten that far out of hand. Was she headed that way? We just don't know, and we never will. But I will say this. When reports began to circulate that the drug MDA had been found in her system on the night that she was murdered on Cielo Drive, her father, Peter Folger, was absolutely livid, and he was in complete and utter denial of the truthfulness of these reports. And so that brings us over to him. Abigail Folger was not close to her father. And there are some reasons for that. In 1952, when Abigail was 9 years old, her parents divorced. Her mother claimed in court documents that the reason for the divorce was for, quote, excessive emotional cruelty, unquote, inflicted upon her by her then husband. And it would seem that Abigail never really forgave her father for what happened. Now, I have no idea what the man may have done, but I do know this. In 1960, 8 years after that divorce, when Peter Folger was 54 years old, he impregnated and then later married his personal secretary, whom he had met while she was still a teenager and a champion tennis player at his local country club. She was 24 years old at that time. So essentially what happened was that at that point, Abigail Folger gained a stepmother who was only 7 years older than she was. And again, for reasons that are unknown, Abigail chose not to attend that wedding. Now, before you accuse me of just rehashing a bunch of salacious gossip and airing out some other family's dirty laundry, there is a reason why I am bringing all of this up. There is a point to be made here about Abigail not being close to her father, and here it is. So in the years that followed Abigail's education at Radcliffe College and then later Harvard, probably around the time that she decided to move back to New York, from everything that I have read about her, it seems like she began to drift further and further away from a close personal relationship with her father. Now, she did have a very close relationship with her mother and spoke with her on more or less a daily basis. Her father, not so much. So it probably makes sense that he would have known basically where she was, what city she was living in, although he probably didn't know exactly where she was living. He certainly didn't know everything about her day-to-day activities. He didn't know who she was seeing or her circle of friends, and that was probably because she didn't want him to. After the tragic events that happened at the house on Cielo Drive, all of those details about his daughter's life that he had been completely unaware of just came crashing in on him in a really big way. And it was very difficult for him to accept many of the details that were now being made public about his daughter's personal life. He didn't like it, and in most cases, he probably also didn't believe it. He didn't believe what he was reading. He didn't want to see. He didn't want to know these details. He also didn't want anyone else to know these details. Now, I am going to do my best to reserve judgment on this man based on what he had to go through. I imagine that he probably was in shock. He was probably traumatized. And I can only imagine how difficult that would have been for him to deal with losing a daughter in such a horrific manner. But the way he chose to deal with what he was seeing in print, magazines, newspapers. Remember, this is 1969. There is no internet. So anything that is written about her is going to end up either in a magazine or in the newspaper. We've already made it very clear that the man had money. And with money, he had power and he had influence. And he had access to attorneys. So during the last 11 years of his life, he passed away in 1980 at the age of 75. He made it more or less his life's mission to keep his daughter's name out of the news and out of the media in any possible way that he could. And that meant threatening journalists, threatening writers, even filing lawsuits in some case. He didn't want her name mentioned at all. Not the good, not the bad, not the ugly. None of it. He wanted that final part of her history to be erased from the public conscience. Was he successful? Well, we're here talking about her now. We're here talking about the events that happened. So I guess you would have to say no. He was probably successful for quite a long time. As a matter of fact, there is relatively little information to be found about her. I think that over the last 10 to 15 years, as the internet has grown, there are more blogs, there are more articles, there is more information about her personal life and the things that were going on at that time. But probably between 1969 and 1980, it would have been very difficult to find any information at all about Abigail Folger. And you would probably have to say that that was due to the efforts of Peter Folger to keep her name out of print. There's also another very good reason, and again, this is not a judgment, but Peter Folger was the CEO and the president of a very large and successful corporation. He did not want the Folger's name, the brand, to be associated with the events that happened in August of 1969 in the Manson family. That was just terrible PR. So in many ways, I think you probably can't blame him. He may have been a little bit heavy-handed in his approach, but based on what happened, he probably felt like it was very appropriate. Now, whether or not anyone else would agree with that, well, that was his family name, that was his daughter, that was his life. That's how he chose to handle it. That was his personal business as far as I'm concerned.